A quiet street, a simple trash can. But when a police dog refused to stop barking, everything changed. Neighbors gathered, fear spread, and when the box inside was finally lifted, what it held left the entire street in shock. But the real question is, why was it hidden there in the first place? Here's the full story. But before we jump in, tell me in the comments, what would your dog have done in this moment? And make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next, you'll regret missing it. The narrow street was always alive with small noises. Vendors called out to sell fruits, bicycles rattled over uneven pavement, and children darted between parked cars. But on that particular evening, the steady rhythm of life was broken by something sharper, something that refused to be ignored. It was the barking of a German Shepherd police dog named Max. Max was usually calm, obedient, and precise in his actions. He had been trained to stay composed even in chaos. Yet that evening, something about the battered green trash can near the corner bakery had set him off. His hackles rose, his body stiffened, and he barked with a force that shook the street out of its routine. People paused, heads turned. Mothers pulled their children closer. No one understood why a police dog, usually disciplined and alert but never erratic, was now circling a trash can as if it held something unthinkable. Officer Daniel Hayes, Max's handler, tightened the leash and tried to calm him, but Max resisted every tug. Instead of moving on, the dog pressed harder, scratching at the ground beside the can and growling deep in his throat. "Easy, boy," Daniel muttered, though even his voice carried a threat of unease. He trusted Max more than most people, and if Max was acting this way, it wasn't without reason. But what reason could there be for a dog to fixate on a trash can? Curiosity spread through the street like fire. Neighbors leaned from balconies, and the baker stepped outside with flour still on his apron. "What's in there?" someone whispered. Another muttered, "Could be food scraps, the smell's strong." But others shook their heads. This wasn't the bark of a dog begging for leftovers. This was warning, urgent, sharp. Daniel crouched down, inspecting the dented metal can. Nothing unusual was visible. Just a few old wrappers stuck to the rim, the smell of rot drifting faintly. But Max wasn't sniffing lazily. He was relentless, his paws scraping at the concrete as if trying to dig through to something hidden beneath. That was when Daniel noticed it. The trash can wasn't standing flush on the ground. It was tilted ever so slightly, one side lifted, as if something underneath was propping it up. His stomach tightened. Instead of opening the can immediately, Daniel made the choice every officer is trained to make: observe before acting. He began scanning the street around the can, and that was when small, unsettling details began to surface. A pair of discarded gloves lay half hidden in the gutter, not the kind used for cleaning, but heavy work gloves worn at the fingertips. Nearby, a torn scrap of fabric clung to a fence, caught like it had been ripped during a hurried movement. Then came the smell, not just the odor of trash, something stronger, metallic, lingering. Daniel's pulse quickened. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces didn't fit the ordinary story of garbage tossed aside. And Max refused to back away. By now, the street had fallen silent except for the dog's barking. Every pair of eyes was locked on that corner, waiting. A group of teenagers, curious but nervous, edged closer. An elderly woman crossed herself under her breath. "What's he found?" someone finally dared to ask. But Daniel had no answer yet. To the people on the street, this was just another ordinary evening interrupted by a dog's strange behavior. But for Daniel, the scene stirred something deeper. He remembered past incidents, cases where criminals used everyday objects as cover. A bag left at a bus stop, a box tucked beneath a bench, things that looked harmless until they were not. And now, a trash can. But unlike those cases, this one had a raw, unsettling energy to it. Because here, in this street full of neighbors and children, Max wouldn't stop until whatever was hidden was uncovered. Daniel radioed in. His voice stayed calm, but his hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "Unit 4, I need backup at 3rd and Maple. Possible concealed item, canine alert. The reply crackled back. Copy that, back up en route. Minutes stretched long. Max continued to bark, his claws scraping until they left marks on the ground. The sound echoed off the narrow buildings. Some residents began to retreat indoors, too unsettled to watch, while others stayed glued to their spots, unwilling to look away. The trash can stood there, battered and ordinary, yet it now carried the weight of something sinister. Every second that passed seemed to deepen the question, what was inside? When the backup unit arrived, 2 more officers stepped out, eyes sharp, hands resting near their belts. They exchanged a quick look with Daniel, then turned their attention to the can. One officer suggested moving the crowd back. Another prepared gloves. The smallest actions, shuffling feet, clearing throats, were amplified by the silence. Daniel knelt again, resting a hand on Max's back. The dog's muscles were taut, quivering with tension, but his eyes never left the can. And in that unwavering stare, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not a false alarm. Before touching the trash can, the officers widened the perimeter. Curious onlookers were gently but firmly guided farther away, leaving only the dog, his handler, and 2 officers near the object. The air grew heavier, a strange stillness gripping the street. One officer whispered, "Could be something dangerous." Daniel's mind churned. Dangerous, yes, but of what kind? A weapon stashed to avoid detection? Evidence discarded in haste? Or worse, something meant to harm others? Every possibility flickered like lightning through his thoughts. As Daniel's gloved hand reached toward the lid, Max lunged suddenly, teeth bared, barking with a ferocity no one had ever heard from him. Daniel froze. His hand hovered inches from the metal. Max's warning wasn't random. It was precise. It was urgent. The entire street seemed to lean forward, breaths caught in anticipation. With a deliberate motion, Daniel pulled the lid free. The metal screeched as it lifted, and the sound cut through the silence like a blade. Everyone strained to see. The inside of the can was filled with ordinary refuse, wrappers, crushed cans, a crumpled cardboard box. For a heartbeat, the tension seemed to deflate. But then Max shoved his head forward, pawing at the cardboard box buried under the trash. He barked again, desperate, his movements frantic. Daniel reached in, fingers brushing the edge of the box. It was heavier than it should have been. Too heavy. Something shifted inside with a dull, muffled sound. He lifted it carefully, lowering it to the ground in front of him. The crowd pressed closer, whispers rising. What could be inside a box hidden under garbage so carefully concealed? Daniel's throat was dry. He could feel the eyes of the entire street drilling into him. The box sat there, small yet heavy with unspoken answers. And Max, now silent, sat back on his haunches, staring at it with unblinking intensity as though the moment of truth was finally here. The box lid trembled under Daniel's hands. What it held was about to change everything. But the mystery for now remained sealed. The box sat on the ground like it carried the weight of the entire street's breath. A hush had fallen over the crowd. Even the children, usually restless, stood frozen, clutching their parents' hands. Daniel Hayes adjusted his gloves, his heartbeat thundering louder than the murmurs around him. His eyes flicked once more to Max. The dog was perfectly still now, but his body leaned forward, ears sharp, eyes locked on the box. Cody, the transformation from barking chaos to tense silence, told Daniel one thing. The danger, or whatever lay inside, was real, immediate, and undeniable. He pulled at the cardboard flap slowly. The edges resisted, damp with moisture and grime, but finally they gave way. Inside was a bundle wrapped in a dirty blanket. It shifted faintly. Daniel's chest tightened. He reached down, peeling the fabric back, and froze. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't contraband. It wasn't evidence of a crime. It was a baby. A newborn, barely a few days old, with pale skin and tiny fists clenched tight. The faint cry that followed as the blanket loosened ripped through the silence, piercing every heart on the street. Gasps erupted. The elderly woman who had crossed herself earlier now pressed both hands over her mouth. The baker staggered back against his shop wall, whispering prayers under his breath. Daniel's throat went dry. He had prepared for explosives, for danger, for something meant to harm. But this was a life fragile and helpless, hidden away like discarded trash. Max whined softly, stepping closer, his once aggressive bark melting into something tender. He lowered his head near the baby, sniffing gently, as though reassuring himself that the child was alive. The newborn squirmed weakly, letting out another broken cry. For a long moment, no one moved. The sight was too shocking, too raw. How could a baby end up in a trash can? Who could leave something so precious to fate, to decay, to silence? But Max hadn't let that happen. Daniel lifted the child carefully into his arms, his instincts shifting from officer to protector. He checked the blanket, thin, damp, not enough for warmth. His voice cracked as he called to his backup. Radio in for medical, now. Infant alive, needs immediate care. The officers sprang into action. One grabbed the radio. Another cleared space for an incoming ambulance. Meanwhile, neighbors huddled closer, their whispers rising like a tide. Was someone trying to hide it? Could it be abandoned? Who would do such a thing? The question stabbed at Daniel as he held the baby tighter. The scattered gloves, the torn scrap of fabric, the faint metallic smell. Pieces clicked together, forming a story. Whoever had left the baby here had done it in haste, perhaps fear. The gloves weren't for work, they were for concealment. The fabric on the fence wasn't just litter, it was the remnant of someone fleeing quickly. Daniel scanned the crowd, wondering if the person who left the baby was still here, hidden among the onlookers, watching with regret or fear. But in that moment, the priority wasn't who, it was what came next. And that was keeping this baby alive. The ambulance siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Daniel looked down at the child. The newborn's breaths were shallow, the tiny chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. He pulled off his jacket, wrapping it tightly around the infant for warmth. Max sat pressed against Daniel's leg, his steady presence grounding him. The dog's instincts had been sharper than anyone's eyes, sharper than any suspicion. Without him, the baby might never have been found until it was too late. When the paramedics arrived, they wasted no time. The infant was transferred into careful hands, examined swiftly, and placed into a carrier designed for fragile lives. Stable, one medic confirmed, though his voice carried weight. Weak, but stable. You got here in time. Relief swept the street. People exhaled together as if they had all been holding their lungs hostage to the same fear. As the baby was carried into the ambulance, murmurs resumed. Who had abandoned the child? Was it desperation, shame, or cruelty? No one knew. The evidence, the gloves, the fabric would be collected, analyzed. Maybe they would lead to the truth. But in the moment, the truth that mattered most was already clear. Max had saved a life. Daniel knelt beside the dog, his hand running through the thick fur. His voice, heavy with both gratitude and awe, broke softly. You knew you wouldn't give up. Max nudged his handler's hand with his nose, as though to say it had never been a question. As the ambulance pulled away, the street slowly returned to life, though it would never be the same again. Neighbors who had once been divided by routine and indifference now found themselves united by what they had witnessed. The baker offered bottled water to the officers. A young man promised to check the security cameras from his family's shop. The elderly woman, her eyes damp, whispered blessings over Max again and again. And in every corner of the street, one thought lingered. Had it not been for the dog, a tragedy would have remained hidden in plain sight. The next day, as Daniel walked Max down the same street, people stepped out of their homes, not to question but to applaud. Children ran forward to pet Max, laughter replacing the fear of yesterday. The baker handed Daniel a bag of fresh bread for the hero dog, and as Max trotted proudly, tail high, Daniel realized the dog had done more than save a baby. He had given the street something it hadn't felt in years: unity, gratitude, and the reminder that sometimes the smallest cries for help are the hardest to hear unless you're listening with a heart like Max's. The trash can, once just a corner fixture, now carried a story no one on that street would ever forget. And for the baby whose life had begun in shadows, the future now shone brighter than anyone could have imagined. Stories like this remind us how a single moment can change everything, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next rescue that will leave you holding your breath. So hit subscribe, drop a like, it keeps us going, and make sure you're here for the next unbelievable twist.